Everything has to be paid for. No country has ever won a war for free, but some countries have borrowed their way into wars they could never afford to finish, and then spent decades paying for that decision long after the last bullet was fired. War debt is not a footnote in the economics of conflict. It is the mechanism through which wars become generational burdens. It is the financial instrument through which today's military decisions become tomorrow's budget constraints. This episode examines how wartime borrowing works, who it ultimately costs, and why the debt accumulated during conflict almost always exceeds the cost of the conflict itself. The battlefield is temporary, the balance sheet is permanent. How war gets financed. When a country enters a prolonged military conflict, peacetime revenue streams, tax collection, trade income, commodity exports are disrupted almost immediately. GDP contracts, tax bases shrink. Meanwhile, military expenditures surge. The gap between what a government spends and what it collects must be filled. There are only three mechanisms available: borrow, print money, or cut civilian spending to the point of social collapse. In practice, most countries use all three simultaneously. Borrowing is the least immediately painful option. Sovereign bonds, international loans, emergency credit facilities — these instruments allow governments to fund war operations without immediately visible consequences for the civilian population. The cost is deferred, transferred to the future, placed on the shoulders of taxpayers who may not yet be born when the debt is contracted. According to IMF data on conflict-affected states, countries engaged in prolonged military operations typically see their debt-to-GDP ratios increase by 40 to 80 percentage points within 3 to 5 years. This is not an anomaly. It is the standard financial trajectory of sustained warfare. They said the conflict would be short and military expenditures would remain within manageable budget parameters. They got a debt-to-GDP ratio that doubled within 2 years, borrowing costs that tripled, and a fiscal position that will constrain government spending for a generation. The borrowing spiral. War debt does not accumulate linearly, it compounds, and the compounding mechanism is brutally simple. As a country's fiscal position deteriorates during conflict, its credit risk increases. Higher credit risk means higher interest rates on new borrowing. Higher interest rates mean each subsequent tranche of debt costs more to service. More debt service means less money available for civilian infrastructure, healthcare, education, the foundations of future economic growth. Less future growth means reduced capacity to repay. Reduced repayment capacity means higher credit risk. This is not a theoretical cycle. It is a documented pattern across multiple conflict-affected economies. The World Bank's analysis of post-conflict debt trajectories shows that countries which entered war with debt-to-GDP ratios below 40% frequently exited with ratios exceeding 80%, and that the interest burden alone consumed between 15% and 25% of government revenue in the years immediately following the conflict. Iraq provides a stark case study. Following the 2003 invasion and subsequent occupation, Iraq's sovereign debt reached approximately $130 billion by 2004, a figure that represented roughly 600% of the country's post-invasion GDP. Debt restructuring negotiations consumed years. The Paris Club debt renegotiation in 2004 resulted in significant write-downs, but Iraq remained in a constrained fiscal position well into the following decade. The cost of servicing wartime debt directly competed with reconstruction spending, healthcare funding, and infrastructure investment. Afghanistan presents a parallel trajectory from the lender's perspective. The United States spent approximately $2.3 trillion on the Afghanistan conflict between 2001 and 2021, according to Brown University's Costs of War project. A significant portion of this was financed through deficit spending, borrowing that added directly to the national debt. The war did not end American fiscal obligations. It transferred them from military budgets to debt service budgets, where they will persist indefinitely. the opportunity cost that never gets reported. Debt is not just a number on a balance sheet. Each dollar borrowed for military operations is a dollar not borrowed for a hospital, a school, a power plant, or a factory. This is the opportunity cost of war debt, and it is almost never discussed in conflict reporting. According to OECD analysis of development spending, $1 billion invested in infrastructure in a developing economy generates approximately $3 billion to $5 billion in GDP over a 20-year period through multiplier effects. The same $1 billion spent on military operations generates no comparable return. It purchases temporary security at best. The economic output is zero. When a country borrows $50 billion to fund a war, it does not simply lose $50 billion. It loses the $150 billion to $250 billion in GDP that $50 billion in productive investment would have generated over 2 decades. The true cost of war debt is not the principal. It is the compounded future that the principal was diverted from. They said military expenditures are an investment in national security and strategic positioning. They got a debt burden that crowds out civilian investment for decades and reduces long-term GDP growth by measurable percentage points. Who pays and who decides? War debt creates one of the starkest asymmetries in the economics of conflict. The people who authorize borrowing are almost never the people who bear the repayment burden. Political leaders make borrowing decisions within election cycles of 2 to 6 years. Debt repayment schedules extend across decades. The political incentive structure actively encourages deficit spending during conflict. The costs are invisible in the short term, and the consequences fall on future administrations. This is not unique to war, but conflict amplifies the pattern to an extreme degree. According to research from the Brookings Institution, governments facing active military conflicts increase deficit spending by an average of 15 to 25 percentage points of GDP above peacetime levels. The fiscal consolidation required after the conflict, the austerity, the tax increases, the spending cuts necessary to stabilize debt, falls disproportionately on populations that had no say in the original borrowing decision. In Greece, the debt crisis that began in 2009 was substantially amplified by military spending that consistently exceeded NATO commitments throughout the 2000s. Greece's defense budget consumed 4% to 5% of GDP during this period, among the highest in Europe, while civilian infrastructure and social services were underfunded. When the fiscal reckoning arrived, it was the civilian population that bore the adjustment costs. Austerity measures reduced healthcare spending, education funding, and social transfers by tens of billions of euros. Military spending, by contrast, was cut more gradually. The post-conflict debt trap. The assumption embedded in most conflict financing is that post-conflict economic recovery will generate sufficient growth to service accumulated debt. This assumption is frequently wrong. Post-conflict economies face severe structural headwinds. Infrastructure is destroyed. Human capital is depleted through casualties, displacement, and brain drain. Institutions are weakened. Foreign investment dries up during conflict and recovers slowly afterward. Trade networks are disrupted. The conditions required for rapid economic recovery, stable governance, functioning infrastructure, skilled workforce, are precisely the conditions that prolonged conflict destroys. The World Bank's analysis of post-conflict recovery timelines shows that GDP per capita in conflict-affected countries takes an average of 15 to 20 years to return to pre-conflict levels. During this entire period, debt accumulated during the conflict must be serviced. The math is unforgiving. A country with a damaged economy, a depleted workforce, and destroyed infrastructure must simultaneously rebuild and repay. In most cases, it cannot do both at the required scale without continued external borrowing, which adds to the debt burden further. Sudan illustrates this trap precisely. Following decades of civil conflict, Sudan's external debt reached approximately $56 billion by 2019, representing over 200% of GDP. Debt restructuring under the HIPC initiative provided some relief, but the country re-entered conflict in 2023, resetting the economic trajectory entirely. The debt from the first conflict was never fully resolved before the second conflict began accumulating its own financial burden. They said post-conflict economic recovery would generate sufficient growth to manage accumulated debt within a decade. They got a 15 to 20-year recovery timeline, continued borrowing requirements, and a debt burden that constrained development spending for an entire generation. The generational transfer. War debt is ultimately a mechanism for transferring costs across time. The generation that fights the war borrows, the generation that follows pays, and the generation after that inherits the reduced economic baseline that results from years of debt service crowding out productive investment. This transfer is rarely made visible in public discourse. Military spending is framed as a current year budget item. Borrowing is discussed in abstract terms. The connection between a cruise missile purchased on credit today and a school not built 20 years from now is never drawn explicitly, because drawing it would require acknowledging that war has a price that extends far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the conflict's end date, and far beyond the lifetimes of those who authorized it. The total cost of American wars since 2001, including long-term debt service on conflict-related borrowing, is estimated by multiple analyses to exceed $6 trillion. This figure will continue to grow as interest compounds and as veteran care obligations, another form of deferred war cost, extend across decades. No single budget line captures this number. It is distributed across years, across administrations, and across the lives of taxpayers who never voted for a single military operation that generated it. Everything has to be paid for, but war debt ensures that the payment is made by people who had no choice in the matter, on a timeline that no politician will survive to see completed, and at a cost that no single budget document will ever fully reveal. This is not a story about military strategy. It is a story about who holds the bill when the fighting stops. And the answer, as it almost always is everyone else. Subscribe to The Price of Conflict. The numbers do not lie, the balance sheets do not take sides, and the debt never goes away.